Racist cops' actions backfire. After Black woman calls her Secret Service. In this eye-opening video, we delve into a shocking incident involving a racist cop whose actions take an unexpected turn. The story begins with a routine traffic stop that spirals into a situation highlighting racial tensions and the misuse of power by law enforcement. This video uncovers the layers of prejudice and discrimination that can occur in everyday interactions and the profound impact these actions have on individuals and communities. If you are enthusiastic about this narrative, please inform us. If you appreciated the video, press 1. If not, select 0. Your feedback genuinely motivates me to collect additional uplifting and significant narratives.
Carefully kept at bay. Renee Washington adjusted the strap of her leather bag as she exited an upscale private club on the edge of the neighborhood. The meeting had run longer than expected, but she was satisfied with the results. Her presence at the table wasn't just a formality. She had led the discussion with the authority and poise that had become her signature. Renee wasn't just any guest at this high-profile gathering. She was a well-respected civil rights attorney with a reputation for being both tenacious and deeply strategic. Her work often drew attention, not all of it positive, but she carried herself with quiet confidence, undeterred by scrutiny. As she stepped onto the cobblestone walkway, she instinctively adjusted her red mugger cap. It was a deliberate choice, one she wore not as a declaration of blind allegiance, but as a statement of complexity. For Renee, the cap symbolized her independence of thought, her willingness to bridge the divides that so many preferred to keep. She knew it would draw stares, perhaps even whispers of disdain, but she embraced it. It was a symbol of her unique place in the political and social spectrum, a Black woman navigating spaces where her presence was often unexpected, sometimes unwelcome. Her polished heels clicked against the pavement as she crossed the quiet street toward the parking lot. She was headed to her black sedan, parked near a tall row of hedges that provided a measure of privacy from the surrounding homes. The night's calm allowed her mind to wander, replaying parts of the conversation she'd just had. She carried a slim folder tucked under her arm, confidential documents outlining upcoming legal strategies. Each piece of paper represented weeks of effort, late nights, and the weight of knowing the cases she fought often had broader implications than just a single verdict. What she didn't notice, however, was the faint hum of a police cruiser a few blocks away. Officer Derek Mills had been patrolling the area on a routine shift. The neighborhood was one he both envied and despised, its pristine streets and polished appearances a sharp contrast to the chaos he often encountered in other parts of the city. For Derek, nights like this were an exercise in monotony. The patrol car's dashboard clock showed 10:47 p.m., marking another hour inching by in his unremarkable shift. But when he spotted Renee walking toward her car, something in him sharpened. Derek narrowed his eyes, his gaze immediately drawn to the bright red mugger cap perched atop her head. To him, it was jarring out of place. The polished, professional Black woman walking alone through this elite neighborhood with a mugger cap. His mind jumped to conclusions almost immediately, fed by years of unchecked biases and frustrations. He had seen her kind before, or so he thought. People who didn't belong, people who had no business walking these streets late at night. And that had it felt like a provocation, an affront to his assumptions, and in some twisted way to his authority. He slowed the patrol car, keeping his headlights dim to avoid drawing her attention. From his vantage point, he noted how she carried herself upright, calm, purposeful. But instead of seeing her confidence for what it was, he misinterpreted it as arrogance, a subtle challenge to his presence. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel as he debated his next move. There was no crime being committed, no call from dispatch to justify his interest. But the uneasy tension in his chest wouldn't let him drive away. He told himself he was simply ensuring everything was as it should be. The truth, however, was far more insidious. Renee opened the trunk of her car and carefully placed the folder inside, pausing for a moment to glance up at the sky. The stars were faint against the ambient glow of the streetlights, but she found the sight calming. She closed the trunk with a soft click and turned toward the driver's side door. That was when she noticed the car. The patrol vehicle was parked just a few yards away, its silhouette unmistakable. The figure inside was obscured by the reflection of the streetlights on the windshield, but she could feel his gaze piercing, judgmental, assessing. She didn't flinch or rush her movements, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her unease. Renee was no stranger to this feeling, the weight of being watched, evaluated, as though her very existence required justification. She got into her car and shut the door, pausing briefly before inserting the key into the ignition. She glanced in her rearview mirror, and sure enough, the cruiser hadn't moved. Her pulse quickened, but she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had dealt with situations like this before, though she never grew used to the implicit hostility they carried. Derek Mills watched as the woman got into her car. He was waiting for her to make a mistake, any mistake, a flicker of suspicious behavior that would give him reason to act. When she didn't, it only fueled his frustration. He reached for the radio mic clipped to his uniform but hesitated. He didn't need backup for this. He told himself it was just a routine check, nothing more. Yet he knew, deep down, that his motivations were far from neutral. He flipped on his lights. The sudden burst of red and blue illuminated the quiet street, casting stark shadows against the manicured hedges. The sound of the siren pierced the stillness, its sharpness making Renee wince. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her mind racing through her options. She knew the protocol: stay calm. Keep your hands visible, comply with instructions, but the knot in her stomach told her this encounter would not be so simple. Renee rolled down her window as the officer approached. His steps were deliberate, heavy, each one echoing against the pavement like a countdown. When he finally reached her door, his posture was stiff, his hand resting too comfortably on the holster at his hip. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his tone sharp and clipped. "Mind telling me what you're doing around here?" Renee met his gaze, her expression neutral but firm. "Is there a problem, officer?" His eyes flicked briefly to her cap before returning to her face. "That depends," he said. "This isn't exactly a neighborhood where people like you are out and about at this hour." There it was. The thinly veiled accusation wrapped in a veneer of authority. Renee's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. This was a game she had played before, one where the stakes were always far higher for her than for the other side. "I'm returning from a meeting," she replied evenly. "Is there a reason you stopped me?" Derek leaned slightly closer, his shadow falling across her face. "Let's just say you caught my attention," he said, his voice carrying an edge that set her on guard. "License and registration. Now." Renee Washington kept her hands on the steering wheel, fingers taut as Officer Derek Mills loomed closer to her car window. His presence carried a weight that seemed to press down on her shoulders, suffocating the air in the already tense space. The flashing red and blue lights danced off the shiny black surface of her sedan, turning the otherwise serene night into a chaotic theater of power and suspicion. "License and registration." "Now," Mills repeated, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise in Renee's head. She had heard that tone before a tone that didn't suggest inquiry but judgment, a decision already made in the officer's mind. Renee tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but measured. "Of course, officer," she said, keeping her voice as neutral as possible. Slowly, she reached for the glove compartment, making sure her movements were deliberate and visible. She could feel his eyes watching every motion, as if he was waiting for her to slip, to give him an excuse. She retrieved her registration and reached for her wallet in her bag, carefully pulling out her driver's license. As she extended the documents toward him, she looked up, meeting his gaze. "Is there something specific I've done wrong?" Mills took the papers without responding immediately. His eyes scanned the documents briefly before flicking back to her face. He took a step back, forcing her to crane her neck slightly to keep him in her line of sight. "This is an affluent neighborhood," he said, his words dripping with insinuation. "You don't exactly look like you live around here." Renee felt her chest tighten, but she kept her composure. She had spent years navigating moments like these, where a simple encounter could escalate into something far more dangerous if she didn't tread carefully. "Officer," she began evenly, "I just came from a meeting at the private club down the street. I'm an attorney." Mills cut her off with a raised hand. "That way you got the hat." His lips curled slightly as he motioned toward the red marga cap still perched on her head. "Interesting choice." The comment wasn't casual, it was laced with mockery, as if the sight of a black woman wearing that hat was some sort of affront to his worldview. Renee didn't take the bait. "It's just a hat," she said coolly, her voice betraying no emotion. Mills chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "Right," he said, drawing out the word as though he didn't believe her. He glanced at the documents again, as if stalling for time, before shoving them back toward her. "Step out of the vehicle." Renee's grip on the steering wheel tightened instinctively. Her heartbeat quickened, though she forced herself to keep her breathing steady. "Why?" she asked, her tone firm but not confrontational. "I've provided you with my license and registration. Everything is in order. What reason do you have to ask me to step out of the car?" Mills leaned down slightly, his face now level with hers. "You asking me to explain myself?" His voice dropped an octave, the threat implicit. "That's not how this works." Renee didn't look away. "I have the right to know why I'm being asked to leave my vehicle, officer. It's the law." That word law seemed to strike a nerve. Mills straightened, his jaw tightening. "You want to talk about the law?" he said, his voice taking on a harsher edge. "Fine. I got a call about suspicious activity in the area. You matched the description." Renee frowned. "What description? I've been driving a car, minding my business. What about me looks suspicious?" Mills didn't answer directly. Instead, he took a step back, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. The motion wasn't subtle, it was deliberate, meant to intimidate. "Out of the car. Now." Renee exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she weighed her options. She knew her rights, but she also knew the reality of situations like these. Standing her ground could escalate the encounter, and that was a risk she wasn't willing to take, not here, not now. Reluctantly, she unlocked her door and pushed it open. Stepping out of the car, she stood tall, refusing to shrink under the officer's scrutinizing gaze. Her height nearly matched his, and the way she carried herself straight-backed, poised, seemed to unnerve him. For a moment, the balance of power in the interaction seemed to shift, though neither said a word. "Turn around," Mills ordered, his tone curt. Renee's jaw clenched, but she complied, pivoting slowly until her back was to him. The night air felt colder against her skin now, and she could hear the faint sound of voices in the distance, likely the club's valet attendants wrapping up their shift. Mills began to search her, his hands hovering near her pockets. It was invasive, unnecessary, and humiliating, but she bit her tongue. This wasn't the time to challenge him, not yet. As his hands brushed past the hem of her jacket, he paused, his fingers grazing the leather strap of her bag. "What's in here?" he asked, his tone almost accusatory. Renee turned her head slightly. "My belongings," she said. And I would appreciate it if you didn't rifle through them without probable cause. Mills smirked. Probable cause. He unzipped the bag without waiting for her permission, pulling it open to reveal her neatly organized items. He rifled through it carelessly, his movements loud and disrespectful. When he came upon the slim folder containing her legal documents, he froze. "What's this?" he asked, holding the folder up. Renee's stomach dropped, but she didn't let it show. "Confidential documents," she said. "I'm a civil rights attorney, and those are related to an active case." Mills opened the folder, thumbing through its contents. His smirk faded as he saw the letters emblazoned on the top of one page, Internal Police Misconduct Review. His eyes flicked back to her, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before it was quickly masked with anger. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. Renee met his glare head-on. "My job," she said simply. The tension between them thickened, the weight of his discovery hanging in the air. Mill's hand tightened around the folder, and for a moment it seemed as though he might say anything, but instead, he shoved the folder back into her bag. "Looks like you've got some interesting reading material," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see what else we find." Before Renee could protest, he turned toward her car. "Pop the trunk," he barked. Renee stared at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "No," she said, her voice firm. "You don't have the right to search my vehicle without a warrant." Mills rounded on her, stepping closer than necessary. "I said pop the trunk," he growled, "or I will have this car impounded, and will tear it apart at the station." The threat hung in the air, and for the first time, Renee felt a crack in her calm exterior. She had been in tense situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a violation. And the man in front of her, with his hand hovering near his gun and his eyes alight with misplaced authority, seemed ready to escalate it even further. Renee Washington felt her composure slipping, though she kept her expression neutral. The air between her and Officer Derek Mills was electric with tension, his demand to open the trunk hanging in the silence. Her mind raced through her options. She could comply and allow him to trample her rights further, or she could stand her ground, knowing full well how dangerous that might be. The flashing lights of his patrol car reflected in her side mirror, casting her reflection in sharp red and blue contrasts, a stark reminder of the line she was walking. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Mills growled, stepping closer to her. The metallic gleam of his hand resting on his gun was deliberate, calculated to intimidate. "Pop the trunk." Renee turned her head to meet his gaze, her voice unwavering. "No, officer, you have no warrant, and you've provided no legal justification for this search. You're overstepping." Mills' nostrils flared, his jaw tightening as her refusal hit him like a slap. He wasn't used to people like her pushing back, especially not in this neighborhood. Especially not someone who looked like her. His grip on his holster tightened. For a moment, Renee wondered if he might actually draw it. Instead, he leaned in closer, his breath hot and sharp as he spoke. "Lady, you think you're smarter than me. You think you know how this works." His voice was low and venomous. "Out here, you do what I say, or I make your life a living hell. Got it?" Renee straightened her shoulders, refusing to cower. "I understand the law, officer," she said, her words measured and deliberate. "And I know you're violating it." Mills stepped back, his face darkening. He turned abruptly, pacing in tight circles, his frustration palpable. He glanced at her car, then at her again, his mind clearly working through his next move. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, before he finally spun back toward her. "All right," he said, his voice dripping with forced calm. You want to play this game? Fine. Let's see how you like it. Without warning, Mills reached for her bag again, yanking it off the roof of the car where he had placed it earlier. Renee flinched at the sudden movement, her composure momentarily cracking. "That's my property," she protested, her voice rising. Mills ignored her, rummaging through the bag with a pointed lack of care. Items spilled onto the pavement: a small notebook, her wallet, her phone. He opened the folder of legal documents again, his eyes scanning its contents with a sneer. The sight of the bold, incriminating titles on the pages, police misconduct review and systemic reform proposals, seemed to fuel his anger. "What the hell is this, huh?" Mills barked, holding up one of the pages for emphasis. "You some kind of activist? Out here trying to stir up trouble?" Renee's hands balled into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. "I'm an attorney," she said sharply, her patience wearing thin. "And you're violating my rights. You have no reason to detain me, let alone rifle through my personal property." Mills smirked, tossing the folder back onto the ground as if its contents were meaningless. "You can shove your rights, lady," he spat. "Out here, it's about keeping things in line. And right now, you're the one out of line." Renee took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She crouched down to gather her belongings, her movements slow and deliberate. Mills towered over her, his posture menacing. As she reached for her folder, he kicked it further away, sending the papers scattering across the asphalt. The cruel smirk on his face sent a surge of anger through her, but she bit back the words bubbling in her throat. "That's enough," she said finally, standing to her full height and locking eyes with him. "You're out of control." Mills snorted, crossing his arms. "Out of control? Lady, you haven't even seen out of control yet." The threat hung in the air, cold and heavy. Renee could feel her pulse in her ears, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She glanced around, taking in her surroundings. The parking lot was mostly empty now, save for a few cars further down. Her earlier meeting had run late, and the nearby private club was winding down for the evening. She was alone here with him. Mills seemed to sense her vulnerability, his confidence growing as he realized there were no witnesses to hold him accountable. "Turn around," he ordered suddenly, his voice sharp and commanding. Renee hesitated. "Why?" she asked, her voice edged with defiance. "Turn." "Around," he repeated, stepping closer. "I'm detaining you for resisting an investigation. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Renee felt her stomach drop. The absurdity of his statement burned in her chest. Resisting? She had complied with every reasonable request, provided her license and registration, answered his questions, and refused only what the law allowed her to refuse. But she knew better than to argue further. This wasn't about legality, it was about power. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate. Mills grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her hands behind her back. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, the sensation sharp and humiliating. Renee clenched her teeth, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "This is harassment," she said, her voice low but firm. "And you will be held accountable." Mills laughed, a harsh, joyless sound. "Accountable? Lady, you're in my world now?" "No one's holding me accountable for doing my job." He guided her toward the hood of her car, pressing her down with unnecessary force. Renee winced as the edge of the metal dug into her stomach, but she said nothing. She could feel the heat of his breath on the back of her neck, the weight of his anger pressing down on her. "Let's see what you're hiding," he muttered, turning his attention back to the car. He reached for her keys, which still dangled from the ignition, and popped the trunk open. The sound echoed through the empty parking lot, a sharp metallic clang that seemed to reverberate in Renee's chest. Mills rifled through the trunk, his movements loud and clumsy. He pulled out a briefcase, flipping it open to reveal a laptop and more legal documents. He rummaged further, tossing aside a neatly folded blazer and a pair of shoes. The longer he searched, the more agitated he seemed to become. "There's nothing here," he muttered under his breath, though the frustration in his voice was unmistakable. He slammed the trunk shut with enough force to make Renee jump, the sound ringing out like a gunshot. He turned back to her, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "You think you're real clever, don't you?" he snarled, stepping closer. "Hiding behind your fancy job title and your little legal jargon. But out here, none of that matters." Renee lifted her head, meeting his glare with a steady gaze. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "None of this matters except the truth. And the truth is you're abusing your power." Mill's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, Renee thought he might hit her, but instead he stepped back, his chest heaving as he tried to regain control of the situation. "You're under arrest," he said finally, his voice cold and flat, "for obstruction and resisting an officer." Renee's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She knew better than to argue further. This wasn't a fight she could win here and now, not with him. But she also knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The metallic clang of the trunk slamming shut echoed through the empty parking lot, reverberating in Renee's chest. She remained pressed against the hood of her car, the cuffs biting into her wrists, a sharp reminder of the power dynamic she was up against. Officer Mills paced behind her, his boots scraping against the asphalt. His frustration was palpable, building with each passing second as his search yielded nothing incriminating. The night air was thick with tension. Renee tried to steady her breathing, but the weight of Mill's hostility bore down on her. The parking lot was eerily silent now, save for the faint hum of distant traffic. The quiet only magnified the sound of Mill's movements as he rifled through her belongings, muttering under his breath. She caught fragments of his words arrogant. "Think you're untouchable, each one laced with venom." Finally, he rounded back toward her, standing over her like a predator sizing up its prey. His face was flushed, his eyes dark with anger. He was no longer trying to conceal his disdain. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" he sneered. "You think flashing some fancy job title and wearing that stupid hat makes you better than me?" Renee lifted her head, meeting his gaze despite the vulnerable position she was in. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was steel beneath her words. "I think knowing the law makes me smarter than someone who clearly doesn't." The jab landed. Mill's jaw tightened, his hands twitching at his sides. For a moment she thought he might lash out physically. Instead, he leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. "Lady, you're this close," he hissed, holding up his thumb and forefinger with barely a sliver of space between them. "This close to me dragging your ass downtown and making sure you regret every word you just said." Renee refused to look away, even as her heart pounded in her chest. "Go ahead," she said evenly, "but you'd better hope your paperwork is spotless. Because when I file my report, every word you say and every action you take will be scrutinized by people a lot more powerful than you." The mention of power clearly struck a nerve. Mills straightened, his sneer faltering for just a moment. But his ego wouldn't allow him to back down. "You think you're untouchable," he spat. "That you can just walk into my neighborhood, act like you own the place, and walk away without consequences." "Your neighborhood?" Renee echoed, her voice tinged with incredulity. "This is a public space, officer. Or do you think your badge gives you ownership of every street you patrol?" Mills opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted him. Both turned their heads toward the source, a pair of sharply dressed men hurrying across the parking lot. Renee recognized them immediately, her colleagues from the meeting earlier. Their presence was both a relief and a new source of tension. She knew Mills wouldn't take kindly to being watched. "Renee," one of the men called out, his voice laced with concern. "What's going on here?" Mills' posture stiffened as the men drew closer. "Back off," he barked, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. "This is a police matter." The two men exchanged uneasy glances but didn't stop their approach. The older of the two, a man named Paul Archer, stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Officer, there's no need for hostility. We're just trying to understand why our colleague is being detained." Mills' eyes narrowed, his suspicion flaring. "Colleague," he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. He looked between the two men, his gaze landing on their expensive suits and polished shoes. "What kind of business are you running here?" Paul's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone polite. "We're attorneys," he said. "We were in a meeting with Ms. Washington earlier this evening. I can assure you, whatever you think she's done, you're mistaken." Mills let out a harsh laugh, the sound grating in the stillness. "Is that so?" he said, his tone mocking. "Well, I guess we'll see about that." He turned back to Renee, his smirk returning. "Your friends here don't change a damn thing. You're still under arrest." Renee's patience finally snapped. "Under arrest for what?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You have no grounds, no evidence, and no justification for this. The only thing I've done is exist in a space you decided I don't belong in." Mills' face darkened, his smirk disappearing. He stepped closer to her, looming over her with a menacing glare. "You're resisting an officer," he growled. "And if you keep running that mouth, I'll find a dozen more charges to add." Paul took another step forward, his voice more forceful now. "Officer, this has gone far enough. You're escalating a situation without cause. I suggest you release her immediately before this gets worse for you." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Mills' eyes flicked toward Paul, his expression hardening. "Are you threatening me?" he demanded. "I'm informing you," Paul said firmly. "You're overstepping your authority, and there will be consequences." The two men locked eyes, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. For a moment, it seemed like Mills might back down. But then, in a move that shocked everyone, he reached for Renee's arm and yanked her upright, pulling her away from the car with unnecessary force. "Fine," he snarled. "You want to play hardball? Let's go downtown. You can explain yourself there." Renee stumbled slightly but quickly regained her footing. She shot Paul a look, silently urging him to stay calm. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Mills ignored her, dragging her toward his patrol car. But as they neared the vehicle, the sound of a car engine roaring to life broke through the tense silence. All heads turned toward the source, a sleek black SUV speeding into the parking lot. The SUV skidded to a stop, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver's door swung open, and a tall, imposing figure stepped out. Renee's heart leapt at the sight of him. It was her husband, General Marcus Washington. Mills froze, his grip on Renee's arm loosening as he took in the man striding toward them. Marcus was still dressed in his military uniform, his medals gleaming under the harsh glow of the parking lot lights. His presence was commanding, radiating authority with every step. "What the hell is going on here?" Marcus demanded, his voice booming. Mills' mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For the first time that night, he seemed unsure of himself. Sir, this is a police matter," he stammered. "Aye. Don't you sir me," Marcus snapped, cutting him off. That's my wife you've got in cuffs. You'd better have a damn good explanation for this, or I'll make sure you regret it. The color drained from Mill's face, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Marcus' glare. He released Renee's arm and took a step back, his hands raising defensively. I was just following protocol, he said weakly. She was acting suspicious. Suspicious? Marcus barked, his voice dripping with incredulity. Suspicious of what? Existing while black. Wearing a hat you don't like. Is that what passes for protocol now? Renee stepped forward, her hands still cuffed but her chin held high. He searched my car without cause, Marcus, she said calmly. Rifled through my things. And when he couldn't find anything, he decided to arrest me for resisting. Marcus' jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with fury. He turned back to Mills, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. Unlock the cuffs, he ordered. Mills hesitated, his hand twitching toward his keys. I don't. Now, Marcus growled, his tone brooking no argument. With shaking hands, Mills fumbled with his key ring, finally managing to unlock the cuffs. Renee rubbed her wrists, her eyes never leaving Mills' face. The tables had turned, and for the first time that night she felt the weight lifting from her chest. This isn't over, Marcus said, his voice like steel. Not by a long shot. The tension in the parking lot was palpable, each second stretching into an eternity. Officer Derek Mills stood frozen, the keys still trembling in his hand after unlocking Renee's handcuffs. The presence of General Marcus Washington had disrupted the fragile balance of power Mills had maintained. But rather than backing down, a flicker of resentment ignited in his eyes. His pride, wounded and battered by the sudden turn of events, demanded retaliation. Renee stepped away from Mills, her wrists sore but her composure intact. She massaged the tender skin where the handcuffs had bitten, her gaze never leaving Mills. Despite her calm exterior, the adrenaline coursing through her veins left her chest tight and her mind alert. She knew this wasn't over. Mills' demeanor made it clear he wasn't going to walk away without trying to salvage his bruised ego. Marcus took a step forward, placing himself between Renee and Mills. His imposing stature seemed to fill the space, a silent warning that Mills would have to go through him to lay another hand on her. You had no right to treat her this way, Marcus said, his voice a low rumble that carried authority. Do you even realize who you're dealing with? Mills bristled at the remark, his defensiveness sharpening into hostility. I don't care who she is, he snapped. She was acting suspicious, and I had every right to detain her. Suspicious? Marcus' tone was incredulous, his eyebrows raising as he folded his arms across his chest. Walking to her car in a parking lot after a meeting is suspicious to you? Or is it the color of her skin that sets off your so-called instincts? Mills' face turned a deep shade of red, his jaw clenching as the accusation landed. Don't lecture me about my job, he growled. I followed protocol. You followed your biases, Marcus shot back. And now you're scrambling to justify your abuse of authority. The two men squared off, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. Renee, sensing the situation escalating dangerously, stepped forward, placing a hand on Marcus' arm. Marcus, she said softly, her voice steady. He's not worth it. But Marcus wasn't ready to let it go. His eyes remained locked on Mills, the fire of righteous anger burning in his gaze. Men like him think they're untouchable, he said, loud enough for Mills to hear. They hide behind their badges and prey on the people they're supposed to protect. It's time someone held them accountable. Mills took a step closer, his hand hovering near his belt. You want to talk about accountability? He spat. How about you keep your wife under control before she causes more problems? The words hung in the air like a slap. Renee felt Marcus tense beside her, his muscles coiling as if preparing to spring. She tightened her grip on his arm, silently willing him to stay calm. But the venom in Mills' tone cut deep, and she could see the effort it took for Marcus to restrain himself. "You're walking a dangerous line, officer," Marcus said, his voice cold and sharp as a blade. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next words." For a moment it seemed Mills might back down. His eyes darted between Marcus and Renee, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But then, in a reckless burst of defiance, he reached for his radio. "Dispatch," he barked, his voice tight with frustration. "I need backup at my location. Possible obstruction and interference." Renee's stomach dropped. She knew what Mills was doing, calling in reinforcements to try to regain control of the narrative. The arrival of additional officers could turn an already volatile situation into something far worse. "Interference," Marcus barked, stepping closer to Mills. "You're doubling down on this. You've already humiliated yourself. Now you want to drag others into your mess." Mills ignored him, his hand gripping the radio tightly as he waited for a response. "Unit 14, a voice crackled back. "Backup en route." Renee felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just about Mills anymore. It was about the system he represented, a system that could mobilize against her and Marcus with devastating consequences. She knew they had to act quickly before the situation spiraled out of control. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice urgent, "we need to de-escalate this." But Marcus shook his head, his eyes never leaving Mills. "No," he said firmly. "This ends here." Before Renee could respond, the distant wail of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. The flashing lights of approaching patrol cars lit up the parking lot, casting long, flickering shadows. Mills straightened, a smug expression creeping onto his face as his reinforcements arrived. 2 squad cars skidded to a stop nearby, and 4 officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts as they surveyed the scene. Mills waved them over, his confidence returning as he took charge. "Glad you're here," he said, gesturing toward Marcus and Renee. "We've got a situation." One of the officers, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached cautiously, his badge read Sergeant Parker. He glanced at Mills, then at Marcus and Renee, his brow furrowing as he took in the scene. "What kind of situation?" he asked, his tone wary. Mills launched into a hurried explanation, painting himself as the victim of interference and obstruction. He conveniently left out the part where he had violated Renee's rights and escalated the encounter without cause. But Parker wasn't buying it. His eyes flicked to Renee, and then to Marcus, recognition flickering across his face. "General Washington," he said, his tone shifting to one of respect. "What's going on here?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "This officer detained my wife without cause," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. "He searched her car, rifled through her belongings, and placed her in handcuffs, all without a shred of justification." Parker's jaw tightened as he turned to Mills. "Is this true?" Mills bristled, his defensive posture returning. "I was following protocol," he insisted. "She was acting suspicious, and I had every right." "Enough," Parker interrupted, his voice sharp. "We're not here to play games, Mills. Either you have a legitimate reason for this, or you don't." The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the air thickening as Parker waited for Mills' response. But Mills remained silent, his jaw clenched as his confidence began to crumble. "Release her," Parker ordered finally, his tone brooking no argument. "She's already free," Marcus said coldly. "But your officer here hasn't learned his lesson." Parker turned to Marcus, his expression serious. "General, I assure you this will be addressed. I'll make sure of it." Renee stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "It's not just about him," she said. It's about the system that allows men like him to abuse their power. If you want to address this, you need to start with more than just reprimanding one officer. Parker nodded slowly, her words clearly resonating. You're right, he said. This won't end here. Mills, now pale and visibly shaken, took a step back, his bravado completely gone. I was just doing my job, he muttered weakly. No, Renee said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. You were abusing it. And now, you're going to face the consequences. The parking lot felt like the eye of a storm, eerily calm yet brimming with the potential for chaos. Officer Derek Mills stood rigid, his earlier confidence unraveling as the weight of his actions began to dawn on him. Around him, the newly arrived officers exchanged uncertain glances, their postures uneasy. Sergeant Parker, the highest-ranking officer present, had taken control, but the situation was far from resolved. The air crackled with tension, a volatile mix of pride, power, and the simmering anger of those who had been wronged. Renee stepped closer to Marcus, her calm exterior masking the storm of emotions swirling within her. She had spent years fighting battles in courtrooms, but this was different. This was raw, immediate, and personal. She could see the anger still burning in Marcus' eyes, his protective instincts warring with his military discipline. He was used to commanding respect, not pleading for it. Sergeant Parker looked from Renee to Marcus, then back to Mills. His expression was stern, his voice level but sharp as he addressed Mills. Officer Mills, he said, I've heard enough to know this situation is out of hand. You've overstepped your authority, and it's time to stand down. Mills' jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. With all due respect, Sergeant, he began, his voice taut with frustration. I was just doing my job. You call this doing your job? Parker interrupted, his voice rising slightly. He gestured toward Renee, his tone laced with incredulity. Detaining an innocent woman without cause, conducting an illegal search, handcuffing her in front of witnesses. That's not doing your job, that's misconduct. Renee stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. Sergeant Parker, she said, addressing him directly. This isn't just about misconduct. It's about accountability. If you let him walk away from this without consequences, you're not just failing me, you're failing everyone he's supposed to serve. Her words hung in the air, a challenge that Parker couldn't ignore. He nodded, his expression grave. You're right, ma'am. There will be consequences. Mills, however, wasn't ready to back down. His face twisted with anger, his voice rising as he turned to Parker. What about me? I was out here doing my job, and now you're throwing me under the bus because these people. Enough. Marcus' voice boomed, cutting through Mills' tirade. He stepped forward, his imposing presence silencing the officer mid-sentence. You're standing here whining about yourself while completely ignoring the harm you've caused. My wife, a respected attorney, was humiliated and assaulted by you because of your ego and your biases. Mills took a step back, visibly shaken by Marcus' intensity. But instead of retreating, he doubled down, his voice shaky but defiant. You don't get it, do you? He spat. People like her don't belong in places like this. She's just another. Before he could finish, Parker stepped between him and Marcus, his face a mask of cold fury. That's enough, Mills, he said sharply. Not another word. But the damage was done. Mills' words had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The other officers looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting on their feet as the weight of his statement settled over them. Renee's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice steady and deliberate. You've just proven my point, Officer Mills, she said. This was never about protocol. It was about prejudice. And now everyone here sees you for who you really are. Mill's face turned a deep shade of red, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. "You don't know me," he growled. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Renee shot back. "I know that you let your biases dictate your actions, and I know that you're now fit to wear that badge." Mill's hand twitched toward his belt, his frustration boiling over into recklessness. The other officers tensed, their hands hovering near their own weapons as the situation teetered on the edge of disaster. For a moment it seemed like Mills might draw his gun, his pride and anger blinding him to the consequences. But before he could act, Sergeant Parker stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Stand down, Mills," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "That's an order." Mills froze, his chest heaving as he struggled to contain himself. Slowly, reluctantly, he let his hand fall to his side. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Parker turned to Renee, his expression grim but respectful. "Miss Washington," he said, "I apologize for what you've been through tonight. I'll make sure this is addressed at the highest level." Renee nodded, her voice calm but firm. "I'll hold you to that, Sergeant." But as the situation seemed to settle, Mills made one last desperate move. "You're all making a mistake," he said, his voice rising with hysteria. "She's not innocent. She's hiding something, I know it." He lunged toward Renee, his hand outstretched as if to grab her again. The motion was sudden, erratic, and dangerous. The officers nearest to him reacted instantly, drawing their weapons and shouting for him to stop. Marcus moved to shield Renee, his body blocking Mills' path. "Get back." One of the officers barked, his gun trained on Mills. Mills froze, his face contorted with rage and fear. He looked around wildly, as if realizing for the first time how outnumbered he was. Slowly he raised his hands, his expression a mix of defiance and defeat. Sergeant Parker stepped forward, his voice cold and authoritative. "Officer Mills, you're relieved of duty effective immediately. Turn in your badge and weapon." Mills hesitated, his pride refusing to let him comply. But the sight of his fellow officers standing against him left him with no choice. With trembling hands, he unhooked his badge and holster, handing them over to Parker. The moment was heavy with finality, the weight of Mills' actions crashing down around him. As Mills was escorted away, Renee felt a surge of relief, though the night's events still lingered heavily in her mind. She turned to Marcus, who placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. But Renee shook her head, her gaze steely. "Not yet," she said. "This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a system that lets people like him thrive. And I won't stop until that system is held accountable." Marcus nodded, his expression filled with both pride and determination. "I'm with you," he said, "every step of the way." As the patrol cars began to disperse, the parking lot fell silent once more. But this time, the silence felt different, less oppressive, more resolute. Renee and Marcus stood together, their presence a powerful testament to resilience and justice. The battle wasn't over, but tonight they had won the first fight. The night sky was still, the earlier chaos fading into the past as the final patrol cars pulled away from the scene. The parking lot was quiet now, save for the soft hum of crickets in the distance. But for Renee Washington, the silence was anything but peaceful. Her body ached, her wrists still tender from the handcuffs, but it was the emotional weight of the evening that bore down on her the most. Standing beside her car, she watched as Marcus spoke with Sergeant Parker one last time. The two men stood several feet apart, their tones low but firm. Parker was outlining the next steps: Mills' immediate suspension, the internal investigation that would follow, and assurances that Renee's rights would be fully acknowledged in the coming days. But even as Parker spoke, his eyes betrayed a flicker of guilt. as if he knew these promises were just the beginning of what needed to happen. Renee leaned against her car, exhaling slowly as she processed the events of the night. The red mugger cap sat in her hands now, its once crisp edges slightly crumpled from the scuffle. She studied it, running her fingers over the stitching as memories of her father flooded her mind. He had always told her to be bold, to embrace symbols that sparked dialogue, even if it made her a target. The world isn't changed by silence, he had once said. It's changed by those brave enough to stand up and demand better. She looked up as Marcus approached, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now that the adrenaline had faded. Renee nodded, though the tension in her shoulders hadn't fully eased. "I will be," she said. "But this can't just end here." Marcus placed a hand on her arm, his grip steady and reassuring. "It won't," he said. "We're going to make sure of that." Sergeant Parker joined them, his stance slightly hesitant. "Mrs. Washington," he began, his tone formal, "I want to apologize again for what happened tonight. Mill's actions were unacceptable, and I assure you we're taking this seriously." Renee met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "Sergeant, I appreciate your apology," she said. "But this isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that allows people like him to act with impunity. If you're serious about change, it has to go deeper than disciplinary action." Parker nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of her words. "You're right," he said, "and I'll do everything in my power to make sure this incident leads to real accountability." "We'll hold you to that," Marcus said, his tone firm. "Because if you don't, I'll take this all the way up the chain. Believe me, I have the connections to make that happen." Parker's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "Understood," he said simply. "I'll be in touch." As Parker walked back to his patrol car, Marcus turned back to Renee. "What now?" he asked, his voice low. Renee looked down at the cap in her hands, her thoughts churning. "We go home," she said finally. "But tomorrow we start building a case." The morning after. The next day dawned with a crispness in the air, the sunlight streaming through the large windows of Renee and Marcus' home. The quiet hum of the coffee machine filled the kitchen as Renee sat at the dining table, her laptop open in front of her. The events of the previous night still loomed large in her mind, but the fire in her chest had only grown stronger. She wasn't just thinking about Mills anymore, she was thinking about all the people who had faced the same abuse and didn't have the resources to fight back. Marcus entered the room, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He placed one in front of Renee and sat across from her, watching as her fingers flew across the keyboard. "Already at it?" he asked with a small smile. "I couldn't sleep," Renee admitted. "Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about how many other people have been in that situation without someone to step in, without the connections to fight back." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "That's why we're doing this," he said. "Not just for us, but for them." Renee paused, glancing up at him. "I'm drafting a formal complaint," she said. "Not just against Mills, but against the department. It's time to demand transparency, body camera footage, internal reviews, retraining protocols. They can't keep sweeping this under the rug." Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he studied her. "And after that?" Renee's lips curved into a small, determined smile. "After that, we go public. This story needs to be told. The reckoning." Over the next several days, Renee's complaint gained traction. News outlets picked up the story, though she was careful to control the narrative. It wasn't about vilifying every officer, it was about exposing the systemic flaws that allowed abuse to persist. With Marcus by her side, she conducted interviews, spoke at forums, and met with community leaders to build momentum for reform. Sergeant Parker reached out several times, providing updates on Mill's status. The officer had been formally suspended, and an internal investigation was underway. But Renee wasn't satisfied with internal action alone. She wanted policy changes, mandatory bias training, increased oversight, and independent reviews of misconduct cases. In one particularly tense meeting with city officials, Renee stood before a panel of lawmakers, her voice unwavering as she outlined her demands. "This isn't just about one bad apple," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "This is about a culture that tolerates and even enables abuse. If you're serious about protecting this community, then you need to start by holding your officers accountable." Her words were met with a mix of applause and resistance, but she didn't back down. She knew change wouldn't come easily, but she was prepared to fight for it. Personal closure. Back at home one evening, Renee sat in her study, the red MAGA cap resting on her desk. She stared at it for a long moment, the memories of her father's lessons washing over her once more. He had always been a complicated man, conservative in some ways, progressive in others. The cap had been his way of challenging assumptions, of forcing people to see beyond the surface. Marcus entered the room, his presence grounding her. "Thinking about him?" he asked, nodding toward the cap. Renee nodded. "He always said symbols are what we make of them," she said. "This one, it's caused so much division. But maybe it can mean something else. Something better." Marcus walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've already started doing that," he said. "Every step you take, every fight you win, it's changing what this symbol stands for." Renee reached up, covering his hand with hers. "We've got a